Hello, friends. Tonight we join you with a story titled The Endless Bureaucracy of Byzantium. A sleep-inducing and deep tale from the forgotten corridors of the Eastern Roman Empire. I would be delighted if you could tell me which country you're from and which part of history interests you most, so I can become more familiar with your preferences. I would be grateful if you enjoyed this video. Please like it, subscribe to my channel, and activate the notification bell. Also, prepare a coffee because tonight you're going to sleep late. In the year 527 of the Common Era, when the morning mist still clung to the 7 hills of Constantinople, there lived a man whose greatest achievement was not conquest nor artistic patronage, but the methodical organization of human tedium into an art form. This man was Justinian. Though history would remember him for his codification of law, few would recall the countless hours of administrative monotony that defined his reign. The palace of the Byzantine emperor was not merely a residence, but a vast machine of documentation, where every sunrise brought with it an avalanche of papyrus scrolls, each requiring the careful attention of men whose entire lives revolved around the precise placement of seals and the correct spelling of provincial tax assessments. In the early hours of that particular morning, as the sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the great palace, a junior secretary named Theodoros made his way through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, their walls lined with countless alcoves, each containing rolls of documents that recorded everything from the number of olive trees in a distant Anatolian village to the precise weight of grain shipments from Egypt. Theodoros had spent the previous evening, as he did every evening, copying a single paragraph of legal text in his careful, measured script. The paragraph concerned itself with the proper procedure for appealing a decision made by a provincial tax collector regarding the assessment of property values for livestock that had been damaged by flood, but only if the flood had occurred during the months between the Feast of the Epiphany and the beginning of Lent, and only if the livestock in question consisted of more than 12 but fewer than 37 animals, excluding goats that were primarily used for milk production rather than meat. As he walked, Theodoros reflected on the beauty of this system, how each day brought its own small contribution to the grand tapestry of imperial administration. Today, he would be copying another paragraph, this one dealing with the appeals process for the previous day's paragraph, a meta-regulation that governed how one might contest the regulations governing contests of regulations. The hallway through which he walked had been constructed during the reign of Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos, an emperor whose surname meant "born in the purple," referring to the purple-lined chamber where imperial children were traditionally born. Constantine VII had been particularly fond of ceremony and had established a series of protocols governing everything from the correct way to approach the imperial throne to the precise number of steps one should take when walking through various parts of the palace. These protocols were maintained by a special class of palace officials called the Logothetes, whose primary responsibility was ensuring that every action taken within the imperial precinct conformed to the established procedures. There were Logothetes responsible for the proper opening of doors, Logothetes who specialized in the correct way to light candles, and Logothetes whose entire career was devoted to the maintenance of the proper silence that should accompany the reading of certain types of documents. Theodoros had once met a Logothete whose job was to ensure that when imperial proclamations were read aloud, the reader paused for exactly the right length of time after each comma. This Logothete, whose name was Nikephoros, had spent 23 years perfecting his understanding of imperial punctuation and could determine, simply by listening, whether a pause after a semicolon had lasted the regulation 2½ seconds or had extended improperly to 2 3/4 seconds. The morning routine in the Great Palace began each day at precisely the moment when the sun's rays first touched the eastern wall of the Chrysotriklinos. the golden reception hall where the emperor held his most formal audiences. At this moment, a bell would ring, not loudly, but with a tone so perfectly calibrated that it could be heard throughout the residential quarters of the palace without being audible in the administrative sections, where such interruptions might disturb the concentration of clerks engaged in particularly delicate copying work. Upon hearing this bell, every member of the palace staff would pause in whatever activity they were performing and recite silently to themselves the oath of administrative fidelity, a prayer composed during the 8th century by a monk named Maximos the Methodical, who had spent his life developing spiritual practices designed to sanctify routine clerical work. The oath was brief but comprehensive. Grant me, O Lord, the patience to copy accurately that which has been copied before, the wisdom to file properly that which must be preserved, and the humility to understand that my small contribution to the great work of imperial administration is both insignificant in itself and essential to the functioning of the state that protects the faithful from the chaos of the world. After completing the oath, each staff member would proceed to their assigned location within the palace complex. For Theodoros, this meant walking from his small sleeping chamber in the eastern wing past the chapel of the Holy Inkwell, where clerks traditionally stopped to pray for clear handwriting, through the Hall of Perpetual Documentation, where the palace's most experienced scribes worked on copying the most important legal texts, and finally to his own desk in the section of secondary appeals, a department responsible for handling appeals of initial administrative decisions. The section of secondary appeals occupied a long, narrow room with windows that faced north, providing steady, even light that was considered optimal for detailed copying work. The room contained 47 desks, each equipped with exactly the same materials. 3 quill pens, one made from the feather of a goose, one from a swan, and one from a pelican, each chosen for their particular qualities when writing different types of documents. 2 inkwells, one containing black ink for ordinary correspondence, and one containing brown ink for documents that required official authentication. A selection of different types of parchment and papyrus, sorted according to the importance and permanence of the documents to be copied. A small knife for sharpening quill points, and a collection of sealing waxes in various colors, each color corresponding to a different level of administrative authority. Theodoros' particular specialty within the section of secondary appeals was the copying of documents related to ecclesiastical property disputes. These were cases where monasteries, churches, or other religious institutions had disagreed with administrative decisions regarding their landholdings, tax obligations, or the validity of donations made to them by private individuals. Such disputes were remarkably common, partly because the Byzantine legal system recognized an extraordinarily wide variety of ways in which property could be transferred, inherited, donated, or seized, and partly because religious institutions were often involved in complex financial arrangements that spanned multiple generations. A typical case might involve a monastery that claimed ownership of a vineyard based on a donation made 50 years earlier, where the validity of the donation depended on whether the donor had properly followed the procedures for religious donations established during the reign of Leo VI, and where the proper interpretation of those procedures was complicated by subsequent modifications made during the reigns of Romanos I and Constantine VII. The documents that Theodoros copied were not the original legal briefs or testimonies, but rather summaries of administrative decisions about these cases. His job was to take the official summary of a case that had been prepared by the section of primary appeals and create a secondary summary that focused specifically on the procedural aspects of how the appeal had been handled, omitting the specific details of the dispute itself, and concentrating instead on whether the proper administrative procedures had been followed during the appeals process. These secondary summaries served several important functions within the imperial bureaucracy. First, they provided a record that could be consulted if questions later arose about whether an appeal had been handled correctly. Second, they served as precedents that could guide the handling of similar procedural questions in future cases. Third, they were used for training new clerks who would study examples of properly handled appeals to learn the correct procedures. Finally, they were compiled into quarterly reports that were submitted to the Master of Offices, who used them to prepare annual summaries of the efficiency and accuracy of the appeals process, which were in turn submitted to the Emperor as part of the comprehensive administrative reports that allowed him to monitor the functioning of his government. The process of creating a secondary summary was itself governed by detailed regulations. Theodoros would begin by reading through the primary summary 3 times, once to gain a general understanding of the case, once to identify the specific procedural steps that had been followed, and once to check for any irregularities or unusual circumstances that might require special attention. After completing these initial readings, he would prepare his writing materials according to the procedures established for ecclesiastical property summaries. This involved mixing a small amount of silver powder into his black ink, not enough to make the text visibly different, but sufficient to ensure that the documents could be authenticated using chemical tests if their genuineness were ever questioned. He would then select a piece of parchment of medium thickness, cut to the standard size for secondary summaries, and prepare his quill using the particular cutting technique that was prescribed for ecclesiastical documents. The actual writing of the summary followed a strict format that had been established during the 10th century and had been refined through generations of use. The document would begin with a standard opening formula that identified the case by number, date, and the administrative section that had handled the primary appeal. This would be followed by a section listing all the relevant legal precedents that had been cited during the primary appeal, with each precedent identified by its date, the reign during which it had been established, and the specific legal principle that it represented. The central section of the summary would provide a step-by-step account of the administrative procedures that had been followed during the appeal, written in a highly standardized language that used specific technical terms for each type of procedural action. This section was typically the longest part of the summary and required the most careful attention to detail, since any errors in describing the procedures could potentially invalidate the entire appeals process. The final section would contain Theodoros' assessment of whether the appeal had been handled in accordance with the established regulations, along with any recommendations for procedural improvements that might be implemented in similar cases. This assessment required considerable expertise, since it involved not only a thorough understanding of the current regulations, but also knowledge of how those regulations had evolved over time, and how they related to the broader principles of imperial administration. Completing a single secondary summary typically required between 3 and 5 days of work, depending on the complexity of the case and the number of precedents that needed to be researched and verified. During this time, Theodoros would work for approximately 6 hours each day, with regular breaks for prayer meals and brief periods of rest to prevent the eye strain and hand fatigue that could result from extended periods of detailed copying work. The work was demanding, but Theodoros found it deeply satisfying. There was something profoundly peaceful about the methodical process of copying, the way that each carefully formed letter contributed to the preservation and transmission of knowledge, the sense that his individual efforts were part of a vast ongoing project that connected him to generations of previous clerks and would continue long after his own death. In the evenings, after completing his daily copying work, Theodoros would often remain at his desk to read through some of the older documents in the palace archives. These included copies of administrative procedures from the early centuries of the empire, when Constantinople had still been called New Rome, and when the bureaucratic systems that now seemed so natural and permanent had been new and experimental. He was particularly fascinated by the gradual evolution of the language used in official documents, the way that certain phrases and formulas had slowly changed over the centuries, becoming more precise and technical as the administrative system became more sophisticated. He could trace, for example, the development of the terminology used to describe different types of property transfers, watching as vague early phrases like "given in perpetuity" had been replaced by highly specific technical language that distinguished between dozens of different types of gifts, bequests, sales and seizures, each with its own legal implications and procedural requirements. This linguistic evolution reflected the broader development of the Byzantine state itself, the gradual transformation of what had originally been the eastern half of the Roman Empire into something entirely new, a civilization that preserved the forms and titles of classical antiquity while developing new institutions and practices adapted to the changed circumstances of the medieval world. As Theodoros worked through these historical documents, he began to understand that his own daily labor was part of this same ongoing process of development and adaptation. Each summary he created, each procedural refinement he suggested, each small improvement in administrative efficiency that resulted from his work contributed to the continuous evolution of the imperial system. He was not merely copying old documents, but participating in the creation of new knowledge, helping to build the institutional foundations that would allow the empire to continue functioning effectively for generations to come. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Bosphorus, casting its golden light across the waters that separated Europe from Asia, another figure in our tale of Byzantine tedium was preparing for her daily routine of scholarly correspondence. Anna Komnenos, daughter of Emperor Alexios, I had devoted her life to a project that would consume decades, the composition of the Alexiad, a detailed chronicle of her father's reign that would require her to exchange countless letters with survivors of battles fought decades earlier, seeking to verify every minor detail of military campaigns that most people had long forgotten. Anna's study, located in a tower of the palace complex that had been specially modified to accommodate her extensive library, was a monument to the Byzantine passion for exhaustive documentation. The walls were lined with shelves containing thousands of scrolls and codices, each carefully labeled and organized according to a classification system that Anna had developed herself after years of frustration with existing methods of organizing historical materials. The morning light filtered through tall, narrow windows that provided excellent illumination for reading and writing while protecting the precious manuscripts from the damaging effects of direct sunlight. Anna had spent considerable time and expense ensuring that these windows were fitted with specially treated glass that reduced glare while maintaining perfect clarity. And she had commissioned craftsmen to create adjustable shutters that allowed her to control the amount of light entering the room with extraordinary precision. At precisely the 7th hour after sunrise, Anna would begin her daily correspondence, a ritual that had continued almost without interruption for more than 15 years. She would start by reviewing the letters that had arrived the previous day, carefully reading each one multiple times and making detailed notes about any new information they contained, any contradictions with previously received accounts, and any questions that they raised that would require further investigation. The letters came from all corners of the empire and beyond. There were retired soldiers who had served in her father's armies during the Norman invasions of the 1080s, former court officials who had witnessed the complex diplomatic negotiations with the leaders of the First Crusade, merchants who had been present during the siege of various cities, and scholars who had studied the military and political developments of the period from different perspectives. Each correspondent presented unique challenges. The retired soldiers often had vivid memories of specific battles and campaigns, but their accounts were frequently colored by the natural tendency of aging veterans to emphasize their own roles and to remember events as more dramatic and clear-cut than they had actually been. Anna had learned to read these accounts with considerable skepticism, cross-referencing each claim against other sources and focusing particularly on details that seemed inconsistent with what she knew about military tactics and logistics. The former court officials were generally more reliable when it came to political and diplomatic matters, but they often wrote with an awareness of how their accounts might affect their own reputations or those of their families. Anna had to read between the lines, understanding that what was omitted from these letters was often as significant as what was included. The merchants provided valuable information about economic conditions and the practical effects of military campaigns on trade and daily life. But their letters were often filled with technical details about commercial practices that required considerable background knowledge to interpret correctly. The scholars were perhaps the most challenging correspondents of all. They were generally careful and accurate in their research, but they often approached historical questions with predetermined theoretical frameworks that could distort their interpretation of evidence. Anna had to carefully separate the facts they provided from the conclusions they drew, evaluating each piece of information independently while remaining alert to the ways in which scholarly bias might affect the selection and presentation of evidence. This morning's correspondence included a particularly complex letter from a former military engineer named Kallinikos, who had been present during the siege of Antioch in 1098. Kallinikos claimed to have detailed knowledge of the siege engines that had been used during the campaign, and he offered to provide technical specifications for several devices that were not mentioned in any of the other sources Anna had consulted. The letter was 12 pages long and written in a careful, precise hand that suggested considerable education. Kallinikos had organized his account chronologically, beginning with the initial planning for the siege and proceeding day by day through the various phases of the military operation. He provided detailed descriptions of the construction and deployment of siege engines, the organization of supply lines, the coordination between different military units, and the negotiations with local allies. Much of this information corroborated accounts that Anna had received from other sources, which gave her confidence in Kallinikos's reliability as a witness. However, there were several details that seemed inconsistent with what she knew about siege warfare during this period, and there were references to military technologies that seemed too advanced for the 1090s. Anna's standard procedure for evaluating such questionable details was to prepare a series of follow-up questions that would test the correspondent's knowledge and consistency. She would ask for additional information about the technical aspects of the siege engines, for the names of other witnesses who might be able to confirm specific claims, and for clarification of apparent contradictions or anachronisms. Composing these follow-up letters required considerable skill and tact. Anna had to phrase her questions in a way that would elicit detailed and honest responses without suggesting that she doubted the correspondent's veracity or competence. She had learned through experience that correspondents who felt that their credibility was being questioned would often become defensive and provide less useful information in their subsequent letters. For the letter to Kallinikos, Anna prepared 7 specific questions about the siege engines, focusing particularly on the technical specifications that seemed most questionable. She asked for additional details about the materials used in construction, the number of workers required for operation, and the specific effects of the engines on the city's fortifications. She also requested information about the chain of command during the siege, asking Kallinikos to identify the officers who had been responsible for different aspects of the operation. In addition to these technical questions, Anna prepared broader questions about the political and diplomatic context of the siege. She asked about the relationships between the different Crusader leaders, about negotiations with local Byzantine officials, and about the reactions of various religious and ethnic communities within Antioch to the changing military situation. The process of preparing these questions required Anna to consult dozens of other sources, checking details and verifying information that she had received from previous correspondence. She would often spend hours reading through old letters, looking for references to specific individuals or events that might be relevant to the current inquiry. This research was facilitated by the elaborate indexing system that Anna had developed for organizing her correspondence. Every letter she received was summarized on a standard form that recorded the sender's name and background, the date of the letter, the main topics covered, and cross-references to related correspondence. These summary forms were then filed according to multiple classification schemes. Chronologically, by the date of the events described geographically, by the location of the events thematically, by the type of information provided, and alphabetically by the names of individuals mentioned. This system allowed Anna to quickly locate all the information she had received about any particular battle, individual, or period, but maintaining it required a tremendous amount of clerical work. Anna employed 2 full-time assistants whose primary responsibility was updating and maintaining the indexes, and she spent several hours each week reviewing their work to ensure accuracy and consistency. The assistants, both young men from scholarly families who were preparing for careers in the imperial administration, found the work intellectually stimulating despite its repetitive nature. They were gaining valuable experience in historical research methods, and they had access to source materials that were available nowhere else in the empire. The senior assistant, whose name was Ioannis Kantakouzenos, had been working with Anna for more than 3 years and had developed considerable expertise in evaluating the reliability of different types of historical sources. He was particularly skilled at identifying discrepancies between different accounts of the same events, and Anna often consulted with him about the significance of apparent contradictions in the evidence. The junior assistant, Mikhail Paleologos, had been hired more recently and was still learning the basic techniques of historical research. His primary responsibility was copying letters and maintaining the basic filing systems. But Anna was gradually giving him more complex tasks as his skills developed. Both assistants were required to follow strict procedures for handling the correspondence. All letters had to be copied before being filed, with the copies stored in a separate location as protection against fire or other disasters. All summary forms had to be reviewed by the senior assistant before being incorporated into the main indexes. All research queries had to be documented with detailed notes about which sources had been consulted and what information had been found. These procedures were time-consuming, but Anna had learned through experience that such careful documentation was essential for maintaining the accuracy and completeness of her research. She had seen other scholars whose work had been seriously compromised by inadequate record-keeping, and she was determined that the Alexiad would be based on the most reliable and comprehensive source materials available. The correspondence with Kallinikos continued for more than 2 years, with letters exchanged every few weeks. Gradually, through patient questioning and cross-referencing with other sources, Anna was able to verify most of his claims about the siege of Antioch and to identify the few details that were inaccurate or anachronistic. The process was typical of Anna's approach to historical research. Rather than accepting any single source as definitive, she sought to build up a composite picture based on multiple independent accounts, carefully evaluating the reliability of each source and resolving apparent contradictions through additional investigation. This methodology was remarkably sophisticated for its time, anticipating many of the principles that would later become standard in academic historical research. Anna understood that all sources were potentially biased or incomplete, and she had developed systematic methods for identifying and compensating for different types of source limitations. Her approach to military history was particularly innovative. Rather than focusing primarily on the dramatic moments of battles and sieges, she paid careful attention to the logistical and organizational aspects of military campaigns. She understood that the success or failure of military operations often depended more on mundane factors like supply management and coordination between different units than on the heroic actions of individual leaders. This focus on practical details made her accounts more accurate and useful than many other historical works of the period, but it also made them considerably longer and more complex. The Alexiad eventually grew to more than 500 pages, with extensive footnotes and appendices documenting the sources for specific claims. Much of the length resulted from Anna's determination to include complete information about even minor aspects of her father's reign. She provided detailed accounts of administrative reforms, diplomatic negotiations, economic policies, and religious controversies, as well as military campaigns. She included biographical information about hundreds of individuals who had played roles in the events she described, often including details about their family backgrounds, education, and subsequent careers. This comprehensiveness reflected Anna's understanding of history as a complex web of interconnected factors rather than a simple narrative of major events. She recognized that political and military developments could only be understood within their broader social, economic, and cultural contexts, and she attempted to provide readers with all the information they would need to understand these contexts. The result was a work of extraordinary richness and complexity, but also one that required enormous patience to read. Anna's prose style was formal and precise, following the conventions of classical Greek historiography while incorporating the technical vocabulary that had developed within Byzantine administrative and military circles. Modern readers often find the Alexiad challenging because of its length, its detailed digressions, and its assumption that readers will be familiar with the complex political and religious controversies of the 11th and 12th centuries. However, for readers with sufficient background knowledge and patience, it provides an unparalleled window into the workings of the Byzantine Empire during one of its most dynamic and challenging periods. Anna herself was well aware that her work would appeal to a limited audience. In her preface, she acknowledged that many readers would find her approach excessively detailed and scholarly. However, she argued that historical accuracy required such thoroughness, and she expressed the hope that future scholars would appreciate her efforts to preserve information that might otherwise be lost. Far from the political intrigues of Constantinople on the isolated peninsula of Mount Athos, where the Aegean Sea meets the morning mist in an eternal dance of grey and silver, there existed a different kind of Byzantine tedium, one perhaps even more profound in its methodical devotion to the preservation of human knowledge. Here, in monasteries scattered across forested hills that had known contemplation for more than 600 years, monks devoted their lives to the copying of manuscripts with a precision and patience that bordered on the supernatural. Brother Simeon the Chronicler had awakened, as he did every morning for the past 43 years, at the moment when the first bell rang across the valley of Vatopedi Monastery. The bell's tone, deep and resonant, carried across the pine forests and stone terraces with a clarity that seemed to slow time itself, calling the community to the first prayers of the day while the world still rested in that perfect silence that exists only in the hour before dawn. Simeon's cell was small and austere, containing only the essential items required for monastic life and scholarly work. A narrow bed, a simple wooden desk, a shelf for books, and a small icon of St. John Chrysostom, the patron saint of scribes and scholars. The walls were thick stone, providing excellent insulation against both heat and cold, and the single window faced east, allowing the morning light to illuminate his workspace while protecting his precious manuscripts from the harsh afternoon sun. After completing the morning prayers with his brothers in the main church, Simeon would return to his cell to begin the day's copying work. Today, like most days, for the past 7 years, he would continue his work on copying the complete works of John Damascene, the 8th century theologian, whose systematic approach to Christian doctrine had made his writings essential texts for Orthodox scholarship. The particular manuscript that Simeon was copying was itself a copy of a 9th century original that had been preserved in the monastery's library for more than 300 years. The text was written in classical Greek, but it included numerous technical theological terms and references to philosophical concepts that required careful attention to ensure accurate reproduction. Simeon's copying technique had been refined through decades of practice. He would begin each morning by preparing his writing materials with ritualistic precision, selecting the appropriate parchment for the day's work, testing his quills to ensure that they produced lines of exactly the right thickness, and mixing his ink according to a formula that had been passed down through generations of monastic scribes. The parchment used at Vatopedi was made from sheepskin that had been processed according to methods that were closely guarded secrets of the monastery. The skins were soaked in lime water for exactly 17 days, then scraped clean using special knives made from a particular type of steel that was obtained from craftsmen in Thessalonica. After scraping, the skins were stretched on wooden frames and dried under carefully controlled conditions that took into account the humidity, temperature, and wind patterns of the specific season. The resulting parchment had a smooth, even surface that was ideal for detailed scribal work, but it was also expensive and time-consuming to produce. Each sheet represented several days of work by the monks responsible for parchment production, and Simeon was acutely aware of the value of the materials he was using. A single error that required discarding a sheet of parchment would represent a significant waste of the community's resources. The ink was made from a recipe that combined oak gall, iron sulfate, and gum arabic in proportions that had been determined through centuries of experimentation. The oak galls were collected from specific trees on the monastery's property during the autumn months, when they contained the highest concentration of tannic acid. The iron sulfate was obtained from merchants who imported it from deposits in Asia Minor, and the gum arabic came from acacia trees in Syria. Mixing the ink required considerable skill and experience. The ingredients had to be combined in exactly the right proportions and allowed to mature for a specific period before use. Too much iron sulfate would cause the ink to eat through the parchment over time, while too little would result in text that would fade within a few decades. The gum arabic served as a binder that helped the ink adhere to the parchment surface, but if too much was used, the ink would become thick and difficult to write with. Simeon had learned the ink-making process from Brother Methodios, who had been the monastery's head scribe for more than 30 years before his death the previous winter. Methodios had been legendary for the quality of his ink, which produced text that remained clear and dark even after decades of storage. His secret had been the addition of a small amount of honey to the basic recipe, which improved the flow characteristics of the ink without affecting its chemical stability. The copying process itself followed strict procedures that had been developed to minimize errors and ensure consistency. Simeon would begin each day by reading through the section of text that he planned to copy, usually consisting of 2 to 3 pages of the original manuscript. He would read it through once for general comprehension, then a second time while making notes about any unusual words or phrases that might be easily miscopied. After completing this preliminary reading, Simeon would begin the actual copying work. He worked with extraordinary care, forming each letter individually and pausing frequently to compare his work with the original. He copied slowly, averaging about 1 page of finished text per day, but his accuracy was legendary throughout the monastery. In more than 4 decades of copying work, he had made fewer than a dozen errors that required correction. The text that Simeon was currently copying dealt with John Damascene's systematic exposition of Christian doctrine, a work that attempted to present the teachings of the Orthodox Church in a logical, comprehensive format that could serve as a textbook for theological education. The work was divided into numerous chapters, each dealing with a specific aspect of Christian belief, and each chapter was further subdivided into detailed discussions of particular theological questions. Many of these theological questions were remarkably subtle and complex, requiring extensive knowledge of both Scripture and the writings of earlier church fathers. John Damascene had addressed issues such as the precise relationship between the divine and human natures of Christ, the role of the Holy Spirit in the process of salvation, the nature of free will and its compatibility with divine foreknowledge, and the proper interpretation of biblical passages that seemed to contradict each other. These discussions often involved elaborate logical arguments that followed the methods of ancient Greek philosophy while remaining grounded in Christian revelation. John Damascene had been trained in both classical philosophy and Christian theology, and his writings represented a sophisticated attempt to synthesize these two intellectual traditions. For Simeon, copying these texts was not merely a mechanical process of reproducing written characters, but an extended meditation on the theological concepts being discussed. As he copied each sentence, he would reflect on its meaning and its relationship to the broader argument being developed. This contemplative approach to copying was encouraged by the monastery's spiritual traditions, which viewed scholarly work as a form of prayer and spiritual discipline. The copying work was punctuated by the regular rhythm of monastic prayer services, which occurred 7 times throughout each day. When the bells rang for each service, Simeon would carefully put down his quill, clean his hands, and join his brothers in the church for communal worship. These interruptions provided natural breaks that prevented the fatigue and eye strain that could result from extended periods of detailed copying work. After each prayer service, Simeon would spend a few minutes reviewing the work he had completed before the interruption, checking for any errors that might have crept in, and ensuring that he remembered exactly where he had stopped in the copying process. This review was particularly important after the longer services, which could last for more than an hour and might cause him to lose track of his place in the text. The monastery's library, where Simeon obtained the manuscripts he was copying, was one of the finest in the Byzantine world. It contained more than 3,000 volumes, including works on theology, philosophy, history, natural science, and literature. Many of these volumes were unique copies of texts that had been lost elsewhere, preserved through the dedication of generations of monastic scholars. The library was organized according to a sophisticated classification system that had been developed specifically for the monastery's collection. Works were grouped by subject matter, with separate sections for biblical commentary, doctrinal theology, ascetical writings, historical works, and secular philosophy. Within each section, works were arranged chronologically by the date of their composition, allowing scholars to trace the development of ideas over time. Each volume in the library was accompanied by a detailed catalogue entry that recorded its contents, the date and place of its copying, the identity of the scribe who had produced it, and any special features or variations that distinguished it from other copies of the same text. This cataloging system made it possible for scholars to locate specific texts quickly and to compare different versions of the same work. The catalogue was maintained by Brother Maximos, who served as the monastery's librarian and had devoted more than 20 years to perfecting the organization and documentation of the collection. Maximos had an extraordinary memory for the contents of individual manuscripts, and he could often direct visiting scholars to exactly the information they were seeking within minutes of hearing their questions. The preservation of the manuscripts required constant attention to environmental conditions within the library. The building had been designed with thick walls and small windows that minimized temperature fluctuations while providing adequate light for reading. The manuscript storage areas were kept at a constant temperature and humidity level through a combination of architectural features and carefully maintained ventilation systems. Each manuscript was stored in a specially designed wooden case that protected it from dust, moisture, and physical damage. The cases were made from cedar wood that had been treated with natural preservatives to prevent insect infestation. They were lined with linen cloth that had been prepared without chemical treatments that might cause damage to parchment or ink over time. The manuscripts were handled according to strict procedures designed to minimize physical stress and contamination. Readers were required to wash their hands before touching any manuscript, and they were provided with special tools for turning pages that prevented oils from human skin from coming into contact with the parchment. Reading was permitted only during daylight hours, when natural light provided adequate illumination without the fire hazards associated with candles or oil lamps. Brother Simeon's copying project was part of a broader effort by the monastery to create multiple copies of the most important texts in their collection. This multiplication of copies served several purposes. It provided backup copies that could preserve the texts if the originals were damaged or destroyed. It made the texts available to other monasteries and scholars who might not otherwise have access to them. And it provided meaningful work for monks whose scholarly inclinations were suited to such detailed, contemplative labor. The project had been ongoing for more than 50 years, and it had already produced hundreds of new copies of classical texts. Some of these copies had been sent to other monasteries throughout the Orthodox world, while others were kept at Vartapedi to build up the monastery's own collection. The work was expected to continue for several more decades, as there were still many important texts that existed in only single copies. The economic aspect of the copying project was also significant for the monastery. High-quality manuscript copies were valuable commodities that could be sold or traded to support the community's needs. Wealthy patrons, both individuals and institutions, were often willing to pay substantial sums for accurate copies of important texts. And these payments provided important income that helped support the monastery's other activities. However, the economic benefits were secondary to the spiritual and intellectual purposes of the copying work. The monks viewed their scholarly labor as a form of service to God and to the broader Christian community, preserving and transmitting the wisdom of previous generations for the benefit of future scholars and believers. Brother Simeon understood that his daily copying work was part of this larger mission. Each carefully formed letter, each accurately reproduced word, each properly completed page represented a small contribution to the preservation of human knowledge and the continuation of Orthodox intellectual tradition. The work was slow and demanding, requiring extraordinary patience and attention to detail, but it was also deeply meaningful in ways that transcended its immediate practical purposes. As the afternoon light began to fade across the monastery courtyard, Simeon would complete his daily copying quota and prepare his materials for the following day. He would clean his quills carefully, seal his ink containers to prevent evaporation, and arrange his parchment sheets in the proper order for the next day's work. These end-of-day rituals marked the transition from scholarly labor to the evening prayers that would conclude another day in the endless cycle of monastic life. The copying of John Damascene's theological works would continue for several more years, each day bringing the project incrementally closer to completion. When finished, the manuscript would join the hundreds of other volumes in the monastery's library, where it would serve scholars and spiritual seekers for centuries to come, a testament to the patient devotion of monks who had dedicated their lives to the preservation of human wisdom. In the year 1453, as the great bronze cannons of Mehmed Sou thundered against the ancient walls of Constantinople, there existed within the dying city a different kind of ending, one marked not by the drama of final battles, but by the quiet completion of administrative duties that had continued unchanged even as an empire breathed its last. In a small chamber within the great palace, a chamber that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the final imperial secretary of Byzantium was completing the last entry in a ledger that had been maintained without interruption for more than 800 years. Constantine Lascaris, whose family name connected him to emperors who had ruled 2 centuries earlier, had served as keeper of the imperial archives for the past 37 years. His position, which might have seemed insignificant amid the military and political crises that had marked the final decades of Byzantine history, had in fact been one of extraordinary importance, for he was responsible for maintaining the documentary continuity that linked the dying empire to its ancient Roman origins. The ledger that Constantine was completing on this morning of May 28, 1453, was titled The Daily Record of Imperial Expenditures and Administrative Actions, and it represented the culmination of a tradition that stretched back to the earliest days of Constantinople. Every day for more than 8 centuries, imperial secretaries had recorded the routine business of government, the payment of salaries to palace officials, the receipt of tax revenues from the provinces, the issuance of official decrees, the maintenance of buildings and infrastructure, and countless other details that collectively constituted the life of the state. Even now, with Turkish cannons pounding the city walls, and with everyone understanding that the end was perhaps only hours away, Constantine continued his daily routine of documentation. There were still salaries to be recorded for the handful of palace guards who remained at their posts, still official correspondence to be filed and indexed, still administrative procedures to be followed with the same methodical precision that had characterized Byzantine government for more than a millennium. The irony of the situation was not lost on Constantine. He was perhaps the only person in the city who was still maintaining the pretense that normal governmental operations would continue, still acting as if the elaborate bureaucratic machinery of the empire would survive to process the documents he was so carefully preparing. Yet he continued his work not out of delusion, but out of a profound sense of duty to the institution he had served for most of his adult life. The morning's entries in the ledger were necessarily brief. There were few expenditures to record, as the imperial treasury had been virtually empty for months. The last provincial tax revenues had arrived more than a year earlier, from the few scattered territories that still acknowledged Byzantine authority. The palace staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew of officials who continued working without pay, motivated by loyalty rather than financial incentive. Yet even these minimal activities required careful documentation according to the procedures that Constantine had learned as a young man and had refined through decades of practice. Each entry had to be written in the proper format, with the correct abbreviations and technical terminology. Each financial transaction had to be recorded in both Greek numerals and the Arabic number system that had been adopted for administrative use during the 14th century. Each document had to be properly dated according to both the civil calendar and the ecclesiastical calendar, with references to the regnal year of the emperor and the year since the founding of Constantinople. These procedural requirements, which had once facilitated the administration of a vast empire, now served primarily to maintain the dignity and continuity of an institution that had outlived its practical purpose. Constantine understood that the elaborate formatting and cross-referencing systems he employed would probably never be consulted by future administrators, but he continued to follow them faithfully because they represented a connection to the broader historical tradition of which he was the final custodian. The previous evening, Constantine had received word that Emperor Constantine the Fighting Palaiologos intended to make a final inspection of the city's defenses before dawn, and that he wished to review certain historical documents related to previous sieges of Constantinople. The emperor was particularly interested in the records from 718, when Leo III had successfully defended the city against an Arab siege that had lasted for more than a year. Constantine had spent several hours locating and preparing the requested documents, which were stored in different sections of the archives according to the classification system that had been developed during the 10th century. The siege records from the 8th century were filed under military operations, defensive actions, while related diplomatic correspondence was classified under foreign relations, Arab Caliphate. Financial records from the same period were maintained separately in the Treasury Operations section. Bringing together all the relevant materials required extensive cross-referencing using the catalogue system that Constantine's predecessors had maintained for centuries. Each document was identified by a complex alphanumeric code that indicated its date, subject matter, and physical location within the archives. These codes allowed experienced archivists to locate specific materials quickly, but they required considerable expertise to decode and use effectively. The documents that Constantine prepared for the emperor's review included official correspondence between the Byzantine court and the Arab commanders, detailed records of food distribution during the siege, reports on the condition of the city's fortifications, and financial accounts showing how the imperial government had managed to maintain essential services during the lengthy blockade. Reading through these materials as he prepared them for the emperor's use, Constantine was struck by the similarities between the crisis of 717-718 and the current situation. In both cases, the city had been surrounded by vastly superior enemy forces, cut off from outside assistance, and forced to depend entirely on its own resources for survival. In both cases, the civilian population had endured severe hardships, with food shortages, disease, and constant military pressure creating conditions of extreme stress. However, there were also crucial differences between the two situations. In 717-718, the Byzantine Empire had still controlled substantial territories in Anatolia and the Balkans, providing potential sources of relief and reinforcement. The imperial navy had been powerful enough to challenge Arab control of the seas around Constantinople. Most importantly, the empire had possessed the financial resources necessary to sustain a long siege, with well-stocked granaries and substantial reserves of gold that could be used to purchase supplies and maintain military forces. None of these advantages existed in 1453. The empire controlled only the city itself and a few surrounding territories. The once mighty Byzantine navy had dwindled to a handful of ships. The imperial treasury was empty, and there were no realistic prospects for outside assistance. Yet Constantine found himself admiring the careful documentation that his predecessors had maintained during the earlier siege. Even under conditions of extreme stress, with the city under constant bombardment and the population facing starvation, imperial secretaries had continued to maintain detailed records of governmental operations. Their ledgers showed daily expenditures for military supplies, weekly reports on food distribution, and monthly summaries of diplomatic communications. This tradition of meticulous record-keeping, which Constantine was now continuing under equally desperate circumstances, represented something profound about the nature of Byzantine civilization. It reflected a deep commitment to institutional continuity and administrative excellence that transcended immediate political and military circumstances. Even when facing extinction, the empire maintained its commitment to the bureaucratic traditions that had sustained it for more than 1,000 years. Constantine's own contribution to this tradition would necessarily be brief. The ledger he was completing would probably contain only a few more entries before the city fell, and the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. Yet he approached his work with the same care and precision that his predecessors had maintained during more prosperous times, understanding that the quality of his documentation would serve as a final testament to the institutional culture that had defined Byzantine government. The last entry that Constantine would make in the imperial ledger was dated May 29th, 1453, and it recorded the final administrative act of the Byzantine Empire. The formal transfer of the imperial seal and the keys to the Great Palace to a trusted subordinate, with instructions that these symbols of imperial authority should be preserved for posterity, even if the government they represented ceased to function. The entry was written in Constantine's careful, precise hand, using the same format and technical terminology that had been employed by imperial secretaries for 8 centuries. It included all the required cross-references and catalogue numbers, as if it were simply another routine administrative transaction, rather than the final act in the history of one of the world's greatest civilizations. After completing this entry, Constantine carefully cleaned his quill, sealed his ink bottle, and arranged his materials for storage. He wrapped the completed ledger in protective cloth and placed it in a specially designed container that would protect it from moisture and physical damage. He then prepared a detailed inventory of the archives under his care, listing the location and contents of every major collection of documents. This inventory, which Constantine completed by candlelight during the early hours of May 29th, represented his final service to the institution he had served faithfully for nearly 4 decades. He understood that the archives would probably be scattered or destroyed in the conquest that was about to take place. But he hoped that his inventory might help preserve at least some portion of the documentary heritage that had been accumulating for more than a millennium. The inventory itself was a remarkable document, demonstrating the extraordinary scope and organization of the Byzantine administrative system. It listed thousands of volumes containing everything from imperial decrees and diplomatic correspondence to tax records and judicial proceedings. It documented the locations of maps, architectural plans, military manuals, and scientific treatises. It provided detailed descriptions of rare manuscripts, unique historical documents, and irreplaceable works of literature and philosophy. Each entry in the inventory included information about the physical condition of the documents, their historical significance, and their relationships to other materials in the collection. Constantine had organized the inventory according to multiple classification schemes, allowing future researchers to locate materials by date, subject matter, geographical region, or administrative function. The completion of this inventory marked the end of Constantine Lascaris' career as an imperial secretary and the conclusion of a bureaucratic tradition that had spanned more than 8 centuries. As he put down his quill for the final time and extinguished the candle that had illuminated his work, Constantine reflected on the strange fate that had made him the final custodian of an institutional heritage that would soon pass into history. Outside his window, the sounds of battle were growing closer as Turkish forces pressed their final assault against the city's ancient walls. Inside the archives, surrounded by the accumulated records of 1,000 years of governance, Constantine waited for the dawn that would bring the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Constantinople. The ledger that Constantine had completed, along with the inventory he had prepared and thousands of other documents in the imperial archives, would indeed survive the conquest, preserved by Turkish officials who recognized their historical value. These records would eventually find their way into libraries and museums around the world, where they continue to provide invaluable insights into the administrative practices and institutional culture of the Byzantine Empire. The final entry in the imperial ledger, written in Constantine Lascaris's careful hand on the morning of May 29th, 1453, stands today as a testament to the bureaucratic traditions that sustained the Byzantine Empire through 11 centuries of triumph and decline. It reminds us that even in moments of dramatic historical transformation, much of human experience consists of quiet, methodical work performed by dedicated individuals who understand that their daily labor contributes to something larger and more enduring than their own immediate circumstances. In the end, the story of Byzantine bureaucracy is not just a tale of administrative procedures and documentary traditions, but a meditation on the nature of institutional continuity and the ways in which human civilizations preserve and transmit their most essential values across generations. The scribes and secretaries, archivists and administrators who maintained the documentary machinery of the empire were engaged in work that was both utterly practical and profoundly meaningful, ensuring that the knowledge and experience of each generation would be available to guide and inform the next. Their legacy survives today not only in the thousands of documents they so carefully preserved, but in the example they provided of patient, meticulous service to ideals that transcend immediate personal and political interests. In a world often dominated by dramatic events and charismatic personalities, they remind us of the quiet heroism of those who dedicate their lives to the maintenance and preservation of the institutional frameworks that make civilized life possible. As we conclude this lengthy journey through the corridors of Byzantine administration, we are left with an appreciation for the extraordinary dedication and skill of the men and women who devoted their lives to the apparently mundane, but actually essential work of governance, documentation, and institutional maintenance. Their story is one of profound patience, meticulous attention to detail, and unwavering commitment to ideals of order, continuity, and public service that remain relevant and inspiring today.